Everyone, welcome back to Policy Punchline. Here at the show, we interview scholars, policymakers, and business executives on urgent issues and frontier ideas in our world today. I'm Sullivan Meyer, and I'm joined by my co-host, Neil Reddy. We're so excited to welcome Mr. Gregory Zuckerman to the show. Mr. Zuckerman is a nonfiction author and special writer at the Wall Street Journal. Before joining the Journal, Mr. Zuckerman was managing editor of Mergers and Acquisitions Reports, a trade publication for Investment Dealers Digest, and the New York Post as a media reporter. At the Journal, Zuckerman is an investigative reporter covering business and investing topics. He is a three-time winner of the Gerald Loeb Award, the highest honor in business journalism. He regularly appears on CNBC, Fox News, Yahoo Finance, Bloomberg Television, and more. Zuckerman's works include The Man Who Solved the Market, Jim Simon's Launch the Quant Revolution, The Frackers, the outrageous inside story of the new Billionaire Wildcatters, and his latest book, A Shot to Save the World, the inside story of the life or death race for a COVID-19 vaccine, which covers the mRNA COVID-19 vaccine development. A Shot to Save the World was longlisted for the Financial Times McKinsey Business Book of the Year Award. Mr. Zuckerman, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, guys.
Great. This book is fresh off the presses, and it's a remarkable achievement. So I want to start by giving our audience kind of an idea of what it's about. Would you mind just giving us a quick synopsis?
Sure. So A Shot to Save the World is the book. I tell the story about how we develop these vaccines. They are modern science's greatest achievement. I would even argue modern finance's greatest achievement. We're a little too close, I think, to these achievements to appreciate them. But in time, I think we will realize as a society how important and life-changing, life-saving they are. So what I do is I go back and I explain how they were developed. And I begin years ago, even decades ago, because these approaches, and I think it's important that people realize that these approaches were developed over many years. So I give you the drama, frankly, that took place as stubborn scientists around the world seized on these unique new approaches and were told to give up on them, and they ignored them. And then I bring you up to 2020 and the drama that took place last year when the virus emerged, and a few interesting characters and efforts decided to focus on developing vaccines and threw themselves into it, that effort and the drama that arose.
Yeah, one thing that struck me about this book when you're talking about this narrative is that we typically discuss the COVID vaccine and focus on how quickly the vaccine was developed. But in this book, you spend the first, 200-300 pages illustrating how this is perhaps a misleading narrative. In fact, the vaccine was developed over many decades, culminating in the race to address the COVID crisis last year. So when you began the process of writing this book, did you expect to start that early?
I like in my work to take a step back and give some perspective. And I also, frankly, like to surprise the reader. So I think most people picking up the book will assume I'm starting sometime in 2018 or 2019. And I do start with a pandemic, but it's not this pandemic. I start with AIDS. And it's been a number of years, obviously. And I think most readers, even older readers, have forgotten or just never knew about that effort and that period and the vaccine chase there. And it's very instructive. There are parallels. And frankly, I'm trying to, and maybe me by saying this, suggest that I have not accomplished it, but I'm trying to subtly let the reader know that it wasn't a foregone conclusion that we'd get these vaccines. So if I first tell you the story about AIDS, then I think on some level, the reader realizes, well, geez, we didn't get a vaccine there. It wasn't a sure thing that we'd get one here. So we appreciate it that much more. And there are all kinds of lessons that we learned from AIDS that we've applied to COVID. And frankly, some of the vaccine approaches that have worked with COVID were developed for AIDS. So I think it's important to go back. And I just find that effort really interesting. And a lot of the reason why I write things is just selfishly, I find them interesting. I want to pursue them. I want to learn about them myself. I didn't know. So I wanted to explore.
Yeah, I think that's that perspective was pretty important when I was reading the book. It's not something I even fully realized. Um, uh, but I think this is also perhaps indicates something problematic about the way we told the story of the vaccine in kind of like the popular media. Um, so like while acknowledging that this is like a revolutionary technology, do you think kind of the language you use around it, Operation Warp Speed, the race that we refer to, do you think it's perhaps harmful to like the public's understanding of like the scientific process that went into this?
I think it is. I think it's a good point. Um, I'm not sure. It is funny because it was developed remarkably quickly, historically. I mean, in 330 days, we went from knowing what the sequence of this virus, this new virus, coronavirus, was, to developing a vaccine or authorization of a vaccine. Not even developing, we developed quicker than that, but just authorization, which is ridiculously fast. And there were reasons why we went faster last year. We could talk about it, but yeah, in some ways that speed does undermine confidence. You know, I speak to a lot of vaccine hesitant groups, or at least sometimes when I give speeches or I'm on TV, there's a segment of the population that's vaccine hesitant, and some of them are reasonable. They're not all people who think that Bill Gates put a chip in our brain with these vaccines. And those vaccine hesitant people rightfully, reasonably say, well, Greg, don't you say in your book that the average vaccine takes 10 years and that the record was 4 years until last year, and that was months. And now you're telling me to take a vaccine that took 330 days. So those people are kind of reasonable and wary for not crazy reasons. So yeah, I do think we the government, whatever, the vaccine companies haven't emphasized enough the long history of these approaches and how long it took to get to them, and that should be reassuring for people. And frankly, I think if you read my book, you'll be reassured. So I am trying to get to more of those kind of audiences. Not that it's my goal. I'm not an advocate necessarily, but I'd like to save lives. If my humble self, as a writer, you don't usually have a chance to do that. If I can help people, I think that'd be great. And I think people should be reassured, and this book should be reassuring.
Yeah, that's a great point. And to circle back to a sort of different theme, um, you spend a lot of time in the book talking about personal narratives, constructing the like narratives of these individuals who are involved in the vaccine development. Why was that so important to you in the creative or in the writing process, and what role do you think it serves in the overall thesis of your book?
So my approach as a writer is a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. In other words, I've written a number of books at this point, and they're usually about really complex, challenging, complicated issues, potentially boring issues. So my first book was about the financial meltdown, 2008. And the second one, and it involved CDO contracts and CES contracts. And then my second book was about the energy revolution and there's fracking and geology. My third one was about algorithms and math. It's about a firm and one person in particular who developed the greatest investment approach and team ever, and firm and funds, and they've just changed everything. And these are, and this one is about biology and viruses. So I always have two different audiences. I have audience of specialists, in this case, scientists, but I also want to appeal to the average person. And so as such, I try to get at it through the people. And I think you can accomplish both. You could write something for the specialist who wants something more technical, but make it entertaining through the people who are responsible for these achievements. I write about individuals, and I go to the same theme each time. I don't do it consciously, but I'm partial to that theme of unlikely characters pulling off something huge that's changed the world and how they did it. And I don't know, and partly I do these things selfishly. I'm partial to that theme. I enjoy people learning about their stories. I mean, I bet each of you and every one of your audience has some interesting story. They've overcome something, some challenge, some obstacle. Maybe your parents did. Maybe your grandparents did. I just find that those stories fascinating. I mean, you can plot me down at a bar mitzvah next to some dentist, and I bet you that dentist got an interesting story I can find. And I'm being genuine about it. I think everyone's got some interesting story, and it's my goal as a writer to explore that and to share that and to make the reader entertain the reader, but also inform the reader through those characters. So yeah, that's my goal. It's my strategy. It works for me. I don't know if it works for everybody, but I also think as writers, my colleagues at least, we don't spend enough time writing about the people. We're very good at breaking news. We reporters, we're very good at the thought pieces and telling you where the world is going. But I want to explore the people behind certain achievements. That's sort of my approach to my writing.
Yeah, and I certainly think that part of what made your book so compelling was the people in it. But it's not just that they're like people. It's that they're like they're really interesting and at some points like iconoclastic people. I mean, these scientists you talk about, they're like dedicated to their work. They're visionaries. They also can be like quite difficult and sometimes toxic. So did you kind of view this as like an unhealthy dynamic in the industry? Why do you think that kind of thing develops? And like, is it a structural issue with the industry, or is it just kind of the way that innovators and visionaries work?
So it's interesting. When I write these books, I often get the reaction, hey, Greg, I really like the book. I just don't know about these characters. Do I like them or do I not like them? And I love that reaction, frankly. I'm a big believer in the gray, and too frequently other writers and others kind of movies, whatever, it's always like black and white, the hero and the villain. And I get why as a narrative approach that works for people, but it's just sort of simple, and it just doesn't reflect life. And maybe I could sell more books if I rounded off the edges to my characters and again made them more distinct as heroes and villains. But I just don't believe in that. And I like to explore that gray. And yeah, I'm not sure myself. And to your point, there are a lot of characters in my book who've changed the world, who've saved lives, who've going to go down in history. Do I want to grab a beer with them? Do I want to have a cup of coffee with them? I don't think so, frankly. I mean, some of them I do know a little better on a more personal basis. I had a little book event a few weeks ago up in Boston, and some of them came and we did break bread together, and they were enjoyable to be around. But to your point, yeah, some of these people are difficult. I mean, specifically Stefan Bancel, the CEO of Moderna. I write in my book about how he pushed his people really hard early on, to the point where they were collapsing in the office. They were collapsing in the parking lot of the office, at home, hitting their heads, going to the hospital, being rushed to emergency rooms. And in his view, in his defense, he believed in their approach, their mRNA approach. And he said, guys, we're going to be the ones in a crisis to save lives, and we need to be prepared. So you could argue that, and you can defend him by saying, okay, he felt this urgency and he wanted his people to feel an urgency. So into your question, maybe it takes people like that, Stefan Bancel, like you said. I mean, he's a little bit like a Steve Jobs kind of character. People said similar things about Steve Jobs, and maybe it takes those types of people to change the world and to save lives, do something historic. Now, I'm not going to say every one of your audience needs to be a jerk to accomplish something big in life. I don't believe that to be the case. I've seen others in my work who are kind, and I also don't want to leave the impression that Stefan Bancel isn't kind. I mean, frankly, to his friends, he's a great friend. He's a better friend than I've ever seen anybody in my life. Frankly, he in the middle of 2020, when his company is going all out to try to build a vaccine, and there's pressure on them. It's not clear they can do it. And he's literally, their lives at stake and his company's future's at stake. And he literally is getting on Zoom calls with friends to find out how they're doing. He's reaching out to others to ask how their jobs search is going. So the point being, he's a great character, like a lot that I like. He's not there are reasons to be critical, but also reasons to really admire them. And yeah, so to your point, I don't know, maybe it takes these outsized characters to do something big, but also my books are about, it's a self-selecting group. I write about the people that succeed. So for every kind of jerk who succeeds in my books, maybe there are 100 that don't, and it didn't help being a jerk. So it's hard for me to say.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting. And I guess I want to move to another part of that, which is sort of the forces at play from the institutions themselves against pushing back against these individuals and their new ideas. It seems like there's a lot of that in this book, like from the larger companies, or maybe even the investors and people in venture capital who they seek to get funding from. Do you think this is a healthy force, or do you think perhaps it's a little bit more inert and these individuals are rightfully pushing back against a lot of stagnance in the biotech, like pharmaceutical industry?
Good question. Yeah, there are all kinds of obstacles that are thrown up in front of all my characters and their approaches, just so your audience is aware, those who haven't read the book or aren't following necessarily that carefully. The messenger RNA vaccine approach was developed over many years, and most, I was about to say many, but most in the scientific community were skeptical, and for good reason. Messenger RNA is a molecule, and it doesn't last very long in the body. So why would you want to bet on an approach that uses this unstable molecule? And the other approach I write about, the viral vector adenovirus approach, which led to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, as well as AstraZeneca vaccine used in Europe and elsewhere around the world. That also had its critics. So to answer your question, listen, I think skepticism is healthy and necessary. And yeah, these people had to overcome all kinds of obstacles. I don't think it's excessive. It's hard for me to say. I mean, frankly, there's so many dreamers out there. There's so many people with pie in the sky ideas, approaches that the experts say are never going to work. So I don't think that the lesson is that there shouldn't be skepticism of these people, because for every mRNA advocate, there's someone advocating for something else that just doesn't work. I mean, on a personal basis, my father passed away and my mother remarried a guy who's a doctor who's got a thesis about autism. And it's an unpopular thesis about the explanation and how to treat autism and stop it. And, maybe he's going to be proven right in the end, but there are all kinds of reasons to be skeptical of him. But I think the better lesson, at least for me personally, is just not to dismiss the dreamers. And there are companies I write about, like this Novavax in my book, that a person like me, a financial journalist at the Wall Street Journal, the stock's trading at $2 a share, I'm very dismissive. I say, well, geez, look at that stock price. They failed over and over and over and over again at finding vaccines. So a guy like me, Greg Zuckerman, would say, just don't, would give up on those guys. And the lesson for me is not to, because in the end, they actually have produced a vaccine that's going to be very effective. And we don't need it really in America, but it is going to be very helpful elsewhere. And the point is, there are serious-minded scientists in the basement of labs around the world. And maybe their stocks are trading at $2 a share, but they've got an approach and maybe it'll work. And it hasn't worked until now, but it still could. So I think the lesson for people like me, cynics or skeptics, is not to be so cynical or skeptical, and to leave hope for some of these dreamers.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see the value in skepticism, and I think we'll get to some of those upsides a little later. But I want to press more a little bit on kind of what seems to be like an endemic kind of skepticism in the institutional industry, especially in the big pharma companies. As you pointed out, the scientific process is about taking risk, and not just taking risk, but like actively failing a lot. But I think especially that like great scene after I'm not sure how to say this word, the adenovirus HIV vaccine. that vaccine failed its early trials. There was a big conference. I'm sure you can describe this a little bit better, where like these scientists kept coming up and saying like, "Oh, we failed. We should not have invested these resources." And it seemed like they had kind of lost an appreciation for like a fundamental part of their job. So can you like kind of see an anxiety about risk and failure creeping in? And is there any way to counter that? Should we counter it?
Well, yeah. So to your point, the stories about how Merck had an approach, and it spent years on it, or several years, an approach to combat, to build an HIV vaccine. And they were excited about it. They thought they'd be the ones to stop HIV. They spent a lot of money and time on it, and it didn't work. And they basically shuttered the whole group. And yeah, you could argue, well, they shouldn't have, but I don't know. They're investors, small and large investors behind these companies. They may not be comfortable losing money. So there's a balance there. And we live in a capitalist system, and I'm a big believer in capitalism. I always say, I kind of joke, it's a version of the Churchill, but it's the worst system other than all the others. So if you've got shareholders in other areas that could be more fruitful, there's reason to shift gears and to not take as much risk. The criticism of big pharma can be that they like incremental advances, a drug that's a little bit better than an existing drug, as opposed to the big home runs. And I would grant you that that's a valid criticism, but there is venture capital money out there, especially in America, more so than any other country. I don't think we appreciate enough the ecosystem in America and how many investors are ready to write checks, huge checks, on the hope that maybe in a decade or so there'll be some profits. I mean, no other country can claim that ecosystem. And frankly, I've talked to the executives of all these companies, and they're often foreign born, and they all say that were it not for America and American investors, these vaccines wouldn't have been created. So yes, while big pharma maybe can be criticized for focusing on incremental advances, there are enough, thankfully, other companies, biotech startup type companies, that are out there shooting for home runs, swing for the fences. So at least we can be reassured about that.
Certainly. And yeah, it's one thing I noticed while reading the book was like the emphasis on sort of getting venture capital money in a lot of these cases, and how these scientists were basically pitching to these firms like basically like a commercial product, like basically like Shark Tank or something like that.
Yeah. Money is a lot more important in this world than I had expected. I'm not from this world, so I figured academic scientists, NIH, you get a lot of money funding and you're off to the races. But they're like politicians. They always have to keep raising money, and it's a huge focus. Yeah.
Right. And I guess like another portion of that question I wanted to ask was if you think that perhaps the dominance of private industry in a good that perhaps has this great public effect should justify maybe more government spending, and like, do you think that would happen in the years to come as a result of what we've seen in the private development of these vaccines?
I'm not a huge fan of just throwing money at problems, or the government throwing money at problems. I like private industry taking the lead. The problem is obviously in terms of pricing, in terms of equity. We're having a real issue now in terms of sharing vaccines. Although I wouldn't fault the companies necessarily. It's the U.S. government as much as at fault as anybody else. The companies are easy targets, but the U.S. government often has locked up these batches of vaccines and won't let the companies, as part of their contracts, share elsewhere. But yeah, I'm not to your question. I'm not a health policy expert, frankly, so I'll defer to others on that question.
Yeah, I think there's an approach to federal funding here. Especially another role of the government is creating these regulatory frameworks. I mean, a lot of the money that these companies wind up having to spend is not on the actual development of the drug or the molecules, but like going through phase 1 trials, going through phase 2 trials, going through phase 3 trials. It's a really hard process to get into the vaccine business. And then you point out that the profit margins are really not crazy high unless you develop something like a COVID vaccine, which is going to billions of people. So do you think that there's a way that the money that the government could not necessarily like throw money, but like kind of target money, or perhaps update the regulatory framework to make it easier for these agile companies that bring these innovative ideas to the market to actually then like turn it into a product and not just an idea?
Well, I think the problem that you mentioned is being solved, and I'll explain why. So, taking a step back, it surprised me very much who it was that stepped up to develop these vaccines. If you think about it, Moderna, no one had heard of going in 2020. BioNTech, no one had heard of. This group in Oxford, University of Oxford, had never developed anything. No drug, no vaccine that was approved or authorized. Novavax, this dinky company going out of business going into 2020. I can go on and on, the people that I write about in my book. And yet they're the ones. And who didn't develop a vaccine? The vaccine giants. Merck. I mean, Merck's got the vaccine that you guys all have. We all have inside us, the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella. They're the vaccine giants. Sanofi, GSK. And why didn't they? I write some about the drama and how Merck debated chasing a vaccine for COVID and did some work. But I would argue that a lot of these companies, to your point, vaccines are not a sexy business historically. You get a vaccine once a year, once a lifetime. That's it. It's just so much you can charge, as opposed to a drug, which is administered every day. You take a statin every day, that kind of thing, or often it's every day. So vaccines have historically never been a really popular business for for-profit companies. So to your question as well, what can the government do to address that? I don't think they need to anymore, because now with the billions and billions that companies like Pfizer and Moderna are making on these vaccines, I think a new era has begun where people realize, investors and others, that vaccines actually can be very profitable. And now they're turning their attention to vaccines for other things, malaria, back to AIDS, cancer, other kinds of things. So I'd like to think that maybe that problem has been solved by all the profits that have been made by these companies over the last few years.
Yeah, I think this is like an interesting thing to point out, because it feels like, and it's a little bit like this with climate change too, to be honest, where it's like it seems like the government's kind of stagnated in passing policy, especially policy that, or industrial policy or research and development policy. And yet, I think you do see in your book like a huge evolution in like the likelihood of success for small companies in the vaccine space. Do you think that's a product of a change of government policy, or is it the product of like more private capital, more high risk capital, VC firms entering the space? I'm sure it's a mix of both, but how do you see it?
Well, the government played a very helpful role last year in terms of Operation Warp Speed, in terms of working with the companies, which is good. But I don't know, will it last? I don't know how long that will last. We were in a pandemic. It's not clear we're going to continue to have that kind of cooperation and urgency. But yeah, listen, I'm at the Wall Street Journal. I'm a capitalist, so I think when there's an incentive for companies, for private companies, public companies, to chase, have a goal that they see they can make lots of money, that creates an urgency and focuses the mind. So just all this money that's been made, I know it gets people uncomfortable, but it creates an incentive for other companies to chase other diseases, illnesses, etc. So I think that's healthy. So the market can be helpful as well, not just public policy.
Yeah, I gotcha. Looking at, I guess, kind of shifting focuses a little bit. We touched on it a little bit, but despite the incredible triumph of the vaccine this year, distrust in science is kind of at an all-time high. Certainly, distrust in vaccines is an all-time high. where's the disconnect between these historically successful results and the public's perception of the field? And did that mistrust motivate you to write this book at all? Did you try to address it and appease it a little bit?
Well, I don't address it specifically overtly. I do it subtly in that I do believe you come away from my book reassured about this process. But yeah, to your point, now you're getting me depressed a little bit. But yeah, it's very discouraging how these scientists have went all out and have this historic achievement, and they really did go all out. I mean, the ones I'm thinking of, that they really have been psychologically damaged by how they've been working 24/7 for over a year to try to develop these vaccines. And then for people not just to be wary or not take them, but to accuse them of trying to harm, or not just the science, not just the vaccine specialists, the public health officials, people like Tony Fauci, et cetera. I mean, they're not faultless, they've made mistakes, but for people to point the finger at them is very discouraging for somebody like me. I mean, everything is politicized today in society. And in some ways, these vaccines were developed because of individualism and the ability of certain people to ignore these skeptics and to say, we're going to figure it out ourselves. But the flip side of that coin is another characteristic of America, where it's that individualism, that I'm going to ignore the experts and rely on this YouTube video I saw, or my brother-in-law spoke to someone and she said, don't take the vaccine, even though my internist of 20 years, who I trust, it says that they're safe and effective. I mean, it's a remarkable period we're in, where there's such skepticism and doubt of public health officials and science. So it's much like everything else in society. Everything it's tribal. It's my side versus your side, and if you like the vaccine, then I can't like the vaccine. It's your team versus my team. So it's a very troubling time we're in.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned like public health's role in all of this. I think they like kind of are an intermediary between the hard science and the people you mentioned in your book, and also just the general population. And I'm sort of curious as to whether from writing this book, you got any sort of insight into how public health had such a massive failure in the last year, and whether there's any sort of connection between these companies and public health, or was it sort of like the government's own doing in creating mistrust in the vaccine, not necessarily the scientists who made the vaccine?
Well, public health can be criticized to the extent that the government can be criticized, I guess, for downplaying the virus early on, for the rollout of the vaccines wasn't done very well. But public health officials have been warning. I mean, Tony Fauci has been warning, other people have been warning about potential pathogens like this one for years. We chose to ignore them, but there had been ample warnings. So people have been prepared, but things like having just masks and such, listen, we're very short-term oriented people, society, civilization. I don't know about other countries, but I know the United States. So for people to plan for a potential in the future seems too much to ask of them. So public health officials, I think, tried their best. They were caught flat-footed to some extent by this pathogen, but not all of them. And listen, we're in an era of pathogens, of viruses, of new viruses often. So we need to be prepared for the next one. I'm not necessarily optimistic we're going to be, but these vaccines will be. So the beauty of mRNA is they can develop a vaccine quickly. So at least we'll know we can turn around and develop a new one, I think, for the next pathogen.
Yeah, I think you raise an interesting distinction here between kind of what the public health community is doing and what the government is doing. One thing that we've heard from government officials a lot over the last years. You want to trust the science, trust the science. What does the science say? But one thing that we see is that the science community, especially the public health community, has a hard time dealing with epistemic uncertainty. I mean, they're scientists, they wait for a lot of data to come in before they make conclusions. And this means that, like, in the early stages of the pandemic and also in the early stages of the vaccine development process, you see there's thousands of experts, all who have their own opinion, who have their own role in the discourse. And there's often not like a unified voice of science. There's just a lot of scientists. So do you think that we as a society, and especially the political system and government officials, need to fundamentally reconsider, our conception of science? And if so, how might you modify it?
Yeah, I guess there should be a better understanding of the scientific process, which means various opinions and debates and disagreements. And it's funny, there are some reasonable people that I do debate with who are, I guess you'd say, vaccine hesitant. They've been vaccinated, but they don't believe in mandates. They're not so sure about masks, or they don't believe in masks, that kind of thing. They're not 100% sold on the vaccines, even though they've been vaccinated. And right, that's the first thing they say. Well, they tell me to believe the science, Greg, but this scientist says this, the scientist says that. But that's the point. The scientific process can be messy, is messy. It should be messy. We don't want them to develop a consensus and stick with it. I mean, that's Tony Fauci's defense when he says, yes, early on, I said, don't wear a mask, and I was wrong. And you could argue he was trying to mislead, and maybe he was, but that's a separate issue. But there was disagreement along the way among scientists, but that is the process. But they do arrive at a conclusion eventually. So yeah, it can be seen as messy, but maybe we need a better understanding of that process, and not to be so quick to accuse and to label and to point fingers. And there's this animosity towards people like Tony Fauci that's just unfounded. Again, he'll make mistakes, and they all have made mistakes. But all those people that I've talked to within the NIH, they're 70, they're 80. They've been going into those labs for years, and frankly, they could have left years ago and made a fortune working for private industry, and they've decided to stay. And you could say, well, they're just power hungry and they want the acclaim. I mean, part of it, I suppose, but mostly they're looking out for us, and they're trying to heal and help. So we need a better recognition of that, I think.
And just to wrap up, as you know, we like to ask all our guests B question for Policy Punchline, which is, what is your punchline, or what is the idea that you'd like our audience to take away from this interview?
I guess it's the fact that these vaccines are modern science's greatest accomplishment. And we need a little more of an appreciation, but also understanding of those accomplishments and how they evolved, and an appreciation for the years of persistence and resilience on the part of these researchers, scientists that I write about, and the drama that went on behind the scenes and what they overcame. So we maybe take it for granted how effective these vaccines are, but just remember back early 2020, middle of 2020, we weren't sure how effective they would be, and even if they'd be developed. So I hope there's a little more of an appreciation of that. And yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys also think. I mean, you guys come at it your own perspective. I'd love to turn around on you guys. How could we have dealt with this pandemic better in terms of the world of science or public policy? Sounds like public policy is your focus. Give me an idea or two that you feel that we didn't do, we could have done better, something that we could have done better.
Yeah, I mean, this is hard to say in retrospect. But I think one thing we've seen with the Biden administration is that we did not see so much in the Trump administration, I guess for a variety of reasons. But, I think Biden goes out and takes steps that are like broadly popular, or like uses the force of the federal government that beforehand the public health community had kind of waffled So you see the vaccine mandates through OSHA. You see approving a third booster shot. You see pushing for waiving the IP with the WHO for the vaccines. And these things have not been universally successful, but I think that they have successfully knocked COVID numbers down. And more importantly, they show that the government is taking an active role in it. And while they're not always, 60 or 70% popular, I do think that they have once again showed that he is taking it seriously, and that he's taking an active role. And I think that's because he is not so concerned with getting a scientifically defensible conclusion from the little bit of data we have. He's just acting with what information he's received. He's acting as a public and governmental leader and less as a scientist. And I think there's something to be learned by the public health community about that. Is at least the way I've kind of seen the last few months, certainly. I don't know if Neil agrees or disagrees with that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my sort of critique of public health would sort of be the idea of messaging and unintended incentives. I think we've sort of seen the last year that public health officials aren't the best people to go on TV to talk about this stuff necessarily, just because of the ways that we've seen people sort of waffle and maybe just come to conclusions that maybe they would change within a week. And it's sort of just been a mess in terms of messaging and getting the population to adopt a sort of stance on COVID, to take it seriously. And so I guess that's probably my biggest critique from what I've seen.
Interesting. Yeah, listen, we were in a pandemic and we've never gone through this before. You could argue AIDS was, but that's a long time ago. So I think we were learning on the go. Some of this is hindsight is 2020 kind of thing. Right. But we can learn. We also can learn from some of these lessons too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've honestly already learned so much. Even though your book, I don't know, your book changed my perspective on the vaccine, and then this conversation did it again. So it's been a real pleasure.
It's been fun for me too, and I encourage your audience, if they want to reach out to me, I'd love to hear different perspectives, constructive criticism, any kind of reaction from the book. I'm easy to find, so please feel free to react.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else you want to plug?
No. Read my books. Let me know what you think, and stay in touch.
Great. Well, that was Mr. Gregory Zuckerman. He has just released A Shot to Save the World, the inside story of the life or death race for a COVID-19 vaccine. My name is Sullivan Meyer. And I'm joined by Neil Reddy. And we hope to see you again here. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
You've been listening to Policy Punchline, a podcast generously supported by the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University. We would also like to encourage you to follow other podcasts produced by Princeton University, such as Politics and Polls by the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Policy Punchline is intended to be informational only and does not reflect nor represent the views of Princeton University or the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. For more information on subscription, donation, volunteering, or contact, please visit policypunchline.com. Thank you again for listening.